Hello, anyone who's here at this moment. We're still waiting back. Matthew's basically in a meeting, I guess maybe with a student or something like that. He said that shouldn't be too much longer though, so we'll be beginning a little bit later than the scheduled time. It's been happening a lot often lately, so just give me a moment, guys. We'll be beginning momentarily. Let's set these up real quick, guys. Just give me a moment. Cool. Okay. All right. Are you ready, Matthew?
Let's do it.
Okay, excellent. Hopefully everything is coming clear here for the chat room. It's a little bit after 1:30 p.m., but to join us today is an assistant professor, Matthew Segall, who I have been actually keeping a kind of a track with for the last 6 or 5 years. Some of your YouTube videos, especially when I was starting out philosophy, I saw some of your German idealist lectures on the internet. So welcome aboard. Thank you for coming up on the show for a little bit to talk about some of your stuff. If you wanted to say anything about who you are and what you do and sort of what your interests are, Matt.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Marty. Pleasure to join you for some philosophical dialogue. It's really what I live for. Um, what to say? I mean, I predominantly read and study and write and teach in the realms of the process philosophical tradition, which I try to extend back to Friedrich Schelling, and who's typically considered a German idealist, but I try reading him as a process philosopher and showing the connections to the 20th century giant of process thought, Alfred North Whitehead, and so yeah, I try to engage in a process philosophical manner, aimed in particular at the trying to carve out a space between uh, science or the sciences and religion and the humanities to try to come up with a way of speaking about the nature of human existence in the midst of this universe in a way that is congenial to everyone and doesn't upset the scientists, doesn't upset the theologians, though I can't say I've had tremendous success in that endeavor, but I'm going to continue trying to build these bridges anyways.
Yes. Okay. Well, I already kind of told you ahead of time that I'm sort of sympathetic with this project. I'm quasi Schellingian. I don't want to commit myself to Schelling or Hegel and anybody in particular. I haven't read Whitehead myself. I've read a lot of the German and idealist thinkers, probably not as well or as extensively as you have. So I kind of wanted to ask some questions in the as we get going. I have read also some process philosophy and analytic philosophy, and I found that a very a sort of a great pathway to kind of like mend the two kind of fields, particularly the historical context with some sort of contemporary process philosophy. I don't know if you've read John Dupree or Nicholson. Yeah, basically that's the sort of
Mhm.
realm that I'm talking about, and that sort of biological realm. So when it comes to biology and all that, I feel a little bit more comfortable with using some of the German idealist terminology. Particularly the concept of community in Kant and the concept of teleology and some of the later German idealist thinkers. Um,
Mhm. Mhm.
so um, so yeah, I guess where to begin? I mean, what do you I guess see within thinkers like Schelling that you don't see in prior philosophies? Like, what do you exactly think is the best portion in Schelling, maybe specifically on his natural philosophy that you can kind of really sympathize with?
Mm. Well, I was going to interrupt when you
Yeah,
said that you're sort of only a quasi Schellingian, and I was going to say that Schelling was only quasi Schellingian
yeah,
because,
sure.
in the sense that he was constantly beginning a new approach to a particular way of systematizing philosophy that he would run with for a year or two, and then he'd give it up and start again from scratch. And so, as the American philosopher Charles Saunders Peirce put it in looking at Schelling's development, that he was an especially scientific philosopher in the sense that he was willing to experiment constantly uh, with new principles, with new concepts to see how they applied, how they reveal different aspects of experience, and that I mean, if you could critique him as Hegel later would for never bringing any system to completion. But on the other hand, we could critique we could critique Hegel for prematurely bringing the system to completion, which Schelling ended up critiquing Hegel for later in his life. So, what is it about Schelling? it's this scientific spirit in which he engages in the philosophic enterprise, and it's something that is characteristic of all the post-Kantian German thinkers, that next generation who picked up Kant's new method of transcendental philosophy and really ran with it, breaking all the rules that Kant thought he had established. I'm thinking of Fichte and Fichte and Schelling and Hegel primarily, though also some of the Romantics, the Schlegel brothers and Hölderlin and Novalis. What they all exemplify is a sense of the maybe at first hidden but profoundly intimate connection between mind and nature, rather than assuming, as the Cartesian strain of philosophy had, that there was some ultimate division between human consciousness and the physical world. Schelling and these other idealist thinkers really wanted to find a way to experientially access the unity of mind and nature, as if prior to reflective thought, which would separate subject and object, there was this sense that we can intuit a unity that is behind the scenes, as it were, and bring it to consciousness, whether through poetry and art or through a new kind of intellectual intuition or scientific cognition. And it's a struggle to do so, and it's not as if any of these thinkers, Schelling included, really, I don't think we can say that they definitively succeeded in a way that that they left us the recipe book so that everyone else can follow in their footsteps to that intuition of the ground of mind and nature and some unifying activity or process. But nonetheless, I think they've done enough to at least highlight this possibility as something worthy of further inquiry and consideration, and that's where most of my work is aimed.
Okay, so I'm gonna write some things down as you kind of go, because you're bringing up a lot of topics that I'm somewhat familiar with, and I'm kind of curious, since you've probably studied a little bit more about these things, what your opinions about them are. And so you mentioned, and I kind of like as well doing a dialogue, and I think I'd agree with you partially, because I'm sort of stuck also between transcendental idealism and absolute idealism sometimes myself. So when I say quasi-Schellingian, I mean it's really hard, I think, if you've read the contemporary Kantian studies like Allison, Langton, or Geyer, or whatever, right, to completely, I think, at least for myself, buy into the later German idealists. So one thing I would say, I mean, I definitely agree with your caricature, I guess, that we need to perhaps, at least in some way, combat the idea of Descartes' cogito, and maybe beginning with the idea of subjectivity. And as I understand it, the later German idealists, especially Schelling, wanted to sort of start within the abyss of being itself. And with Hegel, somewhere within like the science of logic, somewhere within indeterminate immediate being, when we sort of investigate the logic and the ontology of being, rather. And so, I mean, the way that I see the cogito is a sort of, yeah, we try to get the fundamental elements of consciousness, things like the type of simplicity involved in consciousness, the type of unity involved in consciousness, the sort of privacy of consciousness. We see all these sorts of properties, and then we divide it from the rest of nature, and then we sort of divorce form, I think, or at least the form of the mind, from the content of the world. And already within Kant, I think, the very notion of talking about a mind without a world, at least in part, becomes sort of impossible, right? The idea of the experience itself requires two categories to sort of assimilate the idea of an experience altogether, and that is receptivity and spontaneity, right? You have no content, you have no spontaneity, and without spontaneity, you have no content. And so those two sort of dynamically build, I think, the sort of foundations of getting out of this sort of freestanding, to use a Magdalian term, a freestanding subject that sort of exists above and over. But a lot of people still criticize Kant for having some subjectivity that he obviously tries to extract from the world. I mean, that's sort of the project of the critique of pure reason, still, in a sense, is that, well, we're trying to find divisions between the pure concepts of understanding, our understanding, and the sensible world altogether. And so
Mm-hmm.
it makes him a sort of empty formalist according to certain types of criticism. So would you say that would you agree with some of that, or do you want to push back on anything that I said?
No, I think that's a fair characterization of the sort of way that Kant advances upon Descartes by pointing out that we can't actually fully isolate the mental from the physical in our cognition, in the sense that um, Kant isn't as explicit as I would have liked when he, in his transcendental aesthetic, which is far too short of a section in the Critique of Pure Reason, when he discusses space and time as these a priori forms of intuition. that that I think is Kant pointing out the ways that body, the extended domain in Cartesian terms, is always already permeated by the activity of thinking.
Yes.
And so that there's less of a easy division. And Kant's beginning to bring the mind and its cognition into the limits that our embodied sensory organization would allot for them, and showing how we have no experience of body that's not already permeated by our own thinking, basically. And so that the easy Cartesian divide is unjustified. And so I think, Kant is moving us in that direction that culminates in 20th century phenomenology, and it's correcting for that ontological dualism in Descartes.
So you say it's kind of correcting it. One of the things that I sort of myself struggle with is exactly the question of where do you think that Kant kind of goes wrong in his assessment of just metaphysics in general? I mean, what are the sort of criticisms that you would have against Kant, and how would you sort of launch instead? Going into a different type of mindset, like the sort of Whiteheadian or Schellingian or Hegelian one. I mean, we can kind of go into each one of these. I'm a little bit curious about Schelling, since I do some amount of studies within Schelling, and I kind of wanted to kind of pick your brain there, but we could go in the other two directions as well.
Yeah. So, I already mentioned the transcendental aesthetic, and my comment there, that it was far too short for the importance of it in Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. He spends like 20 pages establishing our forms of intuition of space and time as a priori. And Whitehead says this in Process and Reality, that really you could see his own process relational philosophy as replacing the critique of pure reason with a critique of feeling, and really spending way more time on our intuitions of space and time, or space time in the 20th century way of thinking about it. And so my main critique of Kant would be that he did not provide a sort of genetic account of the origins of the categories which determine phenomena. He just sort of says these are the 12, and lists them more or less from Aristotle with a few additions, and then he prematurely limits our capacities for intuition. I think, in a post-Darwinian context, obviously we can translate Kant's transcendental argument into biological terms and say something like, what is a priori for the individual at the level of ontogeny is a posteriori at the level of the species, in the sense that the structures of our cognition, our instincts, and so on, they evolve as species differentiate and so on. But each of us as individuals, we're born with those kind of innate ideas and instincts, and we relate to them as if they were a priori categories that are determining our experience. And so I think we need a more evolutionary understanding of the emergence of these a priori structures. It's not that there isn't anything a priori, it's just what is its relationship to our organic existence. And I think in the American pragmatist tradition, there's a lot of improvement on Kant and then sort of evolutionizing or Darwinizing of Kant, if you will, that helps move this project forward, taking what's of tremendous value and leaving behind I think, residual forms of dogmatism. And a lot of this work was already done by Fichte and Schelling, in the sense that Fichte, in his Wissenschaftslehre, his science of knowledge, tries to show how the categories are generated by acts of intellectual intuition and sort of run through the process whereby we come to experience a world of objects over and against our own subjective activity. Fichte actually generates that structure rather than where in Kant you just sort of are given the categories. And so, yeah.
Yeah, no, you can continue. I did want to break this down for the audience since we have a number of viewers kind of like tuning in. But I understand. I think about 90% of what you're saying. So I think we're on the same ball right here.
Yeah. So good. 90% is pretty good. Yeah. I definitely think that this, it's. I hope I haven't made any overly controversial statements so far. There's not room for disagreement and nuance.
Sure, yeah.
But I think Kant is of tremendous value. I see Kant as sort of the guardian of the threshold of the sort of organic conception of the relationship of mind and nature, and the understanding of the universe as a kind of self-organizing living system. Which is where Schelling starts to bring us, and where Whitehead is bringing us in the 20th century. Kant, refused to grant science the ability to know the possibility of organism or self-organization. He noted that living organisms could not be understood by the categories which determined inorganic nature and in a mechanistic way, but he refused to grant that we could have a genuine science of life. And to my mind, given everything we've learned scientifically in the centuries after Kant, if we can't have a science of self-organization, then we can't even have physics anymore as a properly scientific enterprise. And so I think we need to be able to expand the Kantian restrictions that were placed on the nature of human knowing so as to become capable of grasping the organic dimension of the universe. And I think this is precisely where Whitehead's sense of a critique of feeling becomes so relevant. If we try to balance all of philosophy upon abstract concepts, we're never going to be able to understand life. As Schelling says, life is this sort of mediating term between matter and mind, and it's something that we know by virtue of our being alive and by virtue of our feelings of our organismal feelings, rather. And so if we're going to understand life outside us, we have to first understand our own experience of being alive. And this is something that, Kant was unwilling to grant, at least as a mode of philosophy or as a mode of science. And so it requires widening our conception of what's allowed in science.
Yeah, so I'm going to try to reiterate some of what you said, just so I know I'm following you basically on some of these points. There's a lot said, so I kind of took a little bit of note. And I wanted to explain
Sure.
some of Kant's philosophy to the audience, since we're kind of getting into a lot of the, I mean, not just the critique of pure reason, but now we're getting into Kant's philosophy of nature. So, as I understand it, you basically said, well, the first critique that you had of Kant was basically critiquing that Kant had just set up 12 categories of thought, and these are just sort of ad hoc. These are just sort of ad hoc or just presuppositional sort of categories that he sort of presupposed, and that we could and we ought to sort of develop maybe further categories of thought. And you believe that these sort of, I guess maybe for you, they're not just merely formal structures like they were for Kant. So for Kant, the categories of understanding are sort of ways that we structure the world, right? We have the concepts of understanding, which is modality, relation, quality, and quantity, and those are the sort of four categories of thought, and the most abstracted, in the most abstracted sense of how we understand the world. And then we have the sensible forms of intuition, which is space and time, which Kant believes are ideal. And those, instead of space and time being real, they're ideal sort of forms of making sense of the relations of nature. And you're basically saying, at least with respect to the concepts of understanding, we need a sort of genetic account that is a sort of genetic or Darwinian account of how these categories are made through evolutionary processes, because I'm guessing Kant just sort of left these categories as being completely transcendental, sort of necessary, but we don't know where the consciousness sort of originated from, because it doesn't seem like the type of consciousness that we have, right, is it exhibited in everything within the universe. Obviously, suns can't think. Animals don't have perhaps all these forms of categories of thought, although they might. And so you want to give a sort of Darwinian account there that Kant didn't offer. And lastly, if I'm to understand, the type of categories or the type of way that we understand life is impossible through the categories of understanding that Kant had. This is the part I don't know too much about. I know Hegel basically said, I think within maybe the science of logic or the science of nature, that, it's very hard to give an account of life through, categories that are static or have stasis in them. They're not dynamic and they're not processual. So we can't give an account with Kant, because I remember if I read his Nature about a year ago, he gives an account of basically Newtonian physics, kind of mixed in with what are the sort of prerequisites for, well, matter itself, right? So he gives a sort of transcendental deduction for objects. He basically thinks that we can't just, like Descartes or maybe some other rationalists, empiricists, just basically say the world is just loaded with objects. Look at them sort of hit each other. Look at them sort of transfer momentum. We can't just say these types of things. We have to give like sort of reasons for why objects come about. And Kant did that transcendental deduction. Probably doesn't work. I don't really know. It's hard to say. But nonetheless, he sort of stopped short within physics. I read a book with Winfield, actually, about Aristotle, Kant, and Hegel, kind of talking about how Kant sort of stopped short in physics and didn't get to chemistry or biology because these weren't a science basically within his time. So I understand that Schelling and Hegel, basically, as the chemical and biological revolution took place within the sciences, would have then tried to find, I guess, transcendental deductions or some sort of deductions for the categories of life and chemistry as well, where Kant couldn't. So I think that's where we're at right now, although I don't know what it means to say the categories of thought or the categories of understanding that Kant had are static and can't account for life. And even though I've read Schelling, I guess I've never heard the phrasing that you used, that Schelling gives a critique of Kant with talking about feeling. I'm not quite sure exactly what that means for you. So,
sure.
If you can go kind of from there.
Well, yeah, I appreciate you trying to slow things down here and really break it down. In Kant's third critique, the critique of judgment, that's where he addresses both our judgments of beauty in works of art and also our judgments of purposiveness in nature, both nature as a whole and nature in its individual products, organisms. And it's in that critique of judgment that Kant realizes that organisms exemplify a form of causation which is not the mechanical sort of causation where basically efficient causes, where the cause, where the effect is external to the cause. In organisms, there's a circular causality, which he coins the term self-organization to point out the way in which there seems to be formal and final causation at work in even the simplest forms of life. And he famously says that because we lack the categories to determine organisms, he says there will never be a Newton of even a mere blade of grass, by which he means there will never be a Newtonian explanation in mechanistic terms of living organization.
Yeah. So if I may interrupt you briefly, but the one of the categories of understanding for relation is community, right? So I don't quite get why, if community is a mode of understanding the world, and community being defined, just for the audience sake right here, we're trying to find out how to understand organisms. And one of the way that we understand organisms is that there's a sort of unique type of causality there, of where the parts basically are subsumed under a whole, a dynamic whole where the parts work in a sort of repertoire together. So we have sort of fundamental examples like metabolism, homeostasis, but even intentional actions, right? When consciousness sort of like moves its hand or decides to move its hand, right? There's a sort of type of concept, if you will, that subsumes a lot of the particular parts of our body into that action. And of course, this can't be, this type of action can't, according to Kant and a lot of the German idealists, be explained through just causation in the sense that we have a chain of causes sort of working just sequentially. We need to use something that I read in that philosophy of biology book. We need a synchronic account of causation instead of a diachronic account of causation. So yeah, can you kind of explain what exactly is the sort of thing I'm missing there, and unless you're maybe confused like I am. So
well, I think what Kant says in the Critique of Judgment is that we can judge organisms as purposive beings, but we cannot determine them as such, so that we can have, he says his terminology is, we have a reflective judgment of their purposiveness, but we don't have a determinative judgment. We can't know self-organization as and the circular causality as constitutive of the organism itself. We can only know it as a sort of regulative heuristic that allows us to justify our judgments. And so this is different from the inorganic world, where we have the categories of understanding such that we're capable of determining nature and having objective knowledge of how nature works. Objective in the Kantian sense of objects of appearance, not objects as things in themselves. It's important to distinguish. But nonetheless, mechanical nature, as it appears to us in space and time, can be determined by our categories of understanding, whereas organisms, Kant says, we can merely sort of pass a reflective judgment upon them as if they were purposive, even if we can't really know the grounds of their possibility.
I see.
And
okay.
Yeah, so it's a subtle distinction. But
so I mean, I've read the third critique, and I do recall him saying that, I didn't know we had to understand. I guess that makes sense though. I didn't know we have to understand an organism through reflective judgments instead of theoretical judgments. That is, where we subsume all the particulars underneath a concept, as opposed to not being able to subsume all these particulars, only sort of approach a concept but not quite get there. And I think the phrase that we're looking for within the third critique is that when we're trying to understand life, right, the understanding alone has a way of understanding that life only through itself as a sort of regulation of the mind instead of constitutively of how that organism is in and of itself.
Right.
And I think that might be the sort of move of why we don't fully get at what an organism is or does, according to Kant. So, how would you, I guess, it's always a sort of hard question of moving from the concepts of our understanding to saying that these concepts of our understanding are actually formal properties of the world. So I guess that's maybe a good segue to get us to how do we move from the regulative to the constitutive, from Kant to Schelling with respect to nature and teleological operators.
Yeah, well, it has a lot to do with what you already touched on, which is in some of his late writing, Kant tried to provide a sort of he wanted to show how matter could be constructed transcendentally, and he thought of this in terms of sort of polarization of forces, a expansive and contractive force, and that rather than, as Newton had, imagining that there were sort of pre-given atoms pushed and pulled around by forces, Kant said, what if we just start with forces and derive bodies from the interaction of forces? And so he tried to construct matter transcendentally by thinking in terms of two infinitely opposed forces that would achieve a kind of equilibrium, such that a body is only sort of apparently stable, but is actually this temporary equilibrium reached by opposed forces. And there were some issues. I don't know that we want to get into the technicalities here, but Kant had identified the contractive force with gravity, and then later realized after some critiques that wouldn't quite work, and he just he died before he could work out this problem. Schelling picks up this problem though, and in his early writings in the late 1790s on the philosophy of nature, tries to carry this project forward and basically shows how organism and organicity is and organization is not something merely that shows up merely at the biological level, but in fact characterizes nature from the bottom to the top. So that self-organization is what Kant was trying to get at in terms of how even the simplest material bodies are formed, that there's a sort of reciprocal causality at work and a teleology at work. And Schelling tries to, we've skipped over Fichte here, but Fichte really tried to show how Kant wasn't idealist enough, really, and that even our intuition of our passively given intuitions of the world needed to be understood as something generated by the activity of the eye. And so for Fichte, everything gets swallowed up into the transcendental ego and its activity, that the whole world is in some ways, to use the crude term, a projection of the activity of the mind. And Schelling was very much a student of Fichte's initially, but then realized he wanted nature to have its own autonomy. He wanted nature to be recognized as a creative power in its own right. And so he started to try to apply some of the techniques that Fichte was developing to show how the Kantian categories were generated by acts of cognition. Schelling said, maybe I can use the form of this genetic process that Fichte, this genetic logic that Fichte has developed, and apply it to the genesis of nature itself, such that nature becomes a process of the gradual elaboration upon a simple act. And just as for Fichte, the I is understood to posit the not I, which resists its activity to allow it to become conscious of itself, Schelling builds on Kant's project of these two forces opposed to each other and shows how matter is self-generating and self-organizing, and that the equilibrium of forces reached to produce the simplest material bodies is only temporary, and it sort of spills over itself and generates higher levels of complexity in nature. These series of stages he'll talk about, where you move from simple interactions of gravity and light to electricity and magnetism, to chemistry, to biology, and then on up into human consciousness and culture and art and religion and all of that. And so it's as if Schelling wanted to understand in a more, what's you could call it a objective way or an archetypal way, the forms that for Kant were, or categories that were in the mind, for Schelling become the categories of nature or the archetypal powers of nature. And so he's in a way shifting the locus of formal causation from the subject into the objective world.
Right.
And Schelling ultimately wants to balance these two perspectives,
right.
the more Kantian or Fichtean subjective transcendental philosophy with a more objective philosophy of nature, and show how these two perspectives are they coincide in a way, and that there's a certain limit in our human capacity to grasp the absolute directly, and so we approach it sideways, either from the subject or from the object. And so he tried to have natural philosophy and transcendental philosophy serve as like these two necessary poles of what would be an absolute philosophy, that we can reach the absolute either by looking at how nature generates absolute consciousness or by looking at how absolute consciousness generates nature. And so, yeah, he tries to coordinate these two perspectives in what he eventually came to call an identity philosophy. But that's a lot. I'll pause there and we'll see.
Sure. Yeah.
Where we've landed.
Sure. I haven't. I have that book, but I have not read his identity philosophy yet. So I'll just kind of tell you what I have read, just to give you a sort of ballpark of my ignorance and my the amount of knowledge that I do have. So I mean, I've read his two books basically on nature, the sort of earlier works that Kant had, sorry, that Schelling had, which is I think it was the outlines on the system of nature or something like that.
First outline of the system of the philosophy of nature. Yeah, these are lecture notes, so it's kind of hard to make sense of a lot of the time because he didn't.
Oh, I thought that was some of the clearest writing, when it comes to Schelling, because probably they are lecture notes. And then I read the other one, which is I can't even remember the name. I always forget these two names. I remember the
ideas for the philosophy of nature, probably.
Right. Yeah. And then I read probably a good chunk, like 3/4 of the system of transcendental idealism, and then I read a little bit of his essay on the unconditional in nature, and probably something here or there that I can't remember off the top of my head. I haven't read late Schelling. I keep hearing that late Schelling is crazy, and it just gets into mythology and divine revelation. You might be more sympathetic. I think, like from some of the YouTube videos, I think you might be a little bit more sympathetic to late Schelling. I don't know. But to get back to where we were, now that I kind of went over that, and we can talk about late Schelling later. There's sort of a lot to unpack, and I kind of wanted to press a little bit back. I hate getting to I hate getting into a debate mode or a bloodbath, basically, because especially I saw one of you, the last shows that you did was with someone who seemed very unsympathetic to a lot of your philosophical views.
Oh yeah.
Wore a hat, just kept asking you to provide information for everything, and I thought you were providing information, and he just kept saying you presuppose things, and I'm just like, I don't get it. It's just like, it seems very obvious to me that if you look at anything within the sciences, the biological sciences, you have to cash things out functionally, and with teleology, because I just think like that's what you do when you talk about functions, right? You talk about means and to ends relationships. So it's not like you're gonna make sense of what cells do in relation to an entire body without, I think, ends. And then some of evolutionary theory seems to, I think, as well presuppose intentions, at least with respect to the organism and what they do. And so, of course, natural environmental pressures are going to have something to do with intention. So you can't just have an evolutionary explanation without them. So, anyways, I kind of wanted to say that because that was I found that video sort of frustrating, as you might have.
Yes, I appreciate that.
Yeah.
It was a fellow named David Long, and we might do a follow-up, but remains to be seen.
Yes. So yeah. I guess I hear you on some of the things that you said, and that's basically, at least I get the overview of what you're saying that Schelling is attempting to do. I'm not sure so much if there was an argument for how Schelling attempts to do that. So what we have in Kant is basically that all categories of thought, that the sensible intuition, anything that we consider formal properties of the world, that means ways of making sense of the world through relationships, either causality, either through how it's structured through space and time, if there is a community in an organism, anything about any of the qualities that we mentioned, the quantities that we mentioned, all of these are sort of, I guess, in one sense, of course this isn't literally true, kind of ideal projections, kind of, at least in some sense, just formal properties that are mind dependent. And in a way, I mean, that sort of makes, Kant a formalist, a sort of conceptualist. My question is how do we get out of these sorts of transcendental arguments that Kant just keeps compounding and pressing on within the Critique of Pure Reason? How do we get out of that without becoming dogmatists again? To use Kantian terminology. How do we do it without going back to pre-critical philosophy? Because I mean, it is sort of hard to, I think, argue that any sort of empirical objects that we see sort of do presuppose space and time, right? In order for them to understand, in order for us to understand it. Any objects within our cognition, in order to talk about those objects, presuppose magnitude. And if they presuppose magnitude and temporality, right, since understanding is a temporal activity, space and time seem to be presupposed as sort of sensible conditions of our intuition. That, and a lot of people just push back with certain types of nominalist and conceptualist philosophies. I think Kant would be a conceptualist, but sometimes I don't see the difference. Sometimes it's hard to see a difference between those two. Pushes back on a type of conceptualism where, substances and essences and all these things don't really exist in themselves, right? They're sort of also sort of ideal conditions that the mind postulates and synthesizes with the content. So my question is how do we get into this notion of the Schellingian intellectual intuition? How do we have this sort of immediate intellectual intuition? How is that possible? How is it possible to get at the very notion of nature constitutively without just sort of begging the question against Kant?
Yeah, well, I think a lot of it has to do with zeroing in on the paradoxes that arise when Kant posits this realm of things in themselves, which, he marks with the sort of algebraic X, saying that, it's not anything we can know anything about other than that it is. And the post-Kantians, Fichte and then Schelling would point to places in the first critique where Kant seems to, and this is a controversial point, whether Kant is really contradicting himself, but there are places where it seems like he's saying that this realm of things in themselves is the cause of our sensations. And that's to apply a category of understanding that Kant says is meant to be limited to the phenomenal realm to something beyond the phenomenal realm. And so basically Fichte and Schelling would argue that Kant was either overextending the transcendental method by applying a category to the noumenal realm, like causation, or that Kant was unwittingly showing us the way beyond the limitations that he had placed on knowledge. And then the next place to look for this pathway is in the Critique of Judgment again, where Kant starts to imagine other forms of knowing, other types of intelligence, beyond our discursive mode of understanding as human beings. He imagines an archetypal intelligence that that possesses a kind of intellectual intuition, which would be a form of intuition that's not passive like ours, but that is creative. And he thought that this type of intuitive understanding, which would be again a spontaneous form of intuition, that this would be what would be required for us to grasp living organization in a constitutive and determinative way.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Kant didn't think that this was possible for us.
Right.
He thought, he makes another distinction between, he defines genius in the realm of the arts as sort of when an artist is able to tap into the creative power of nature and become a sort of instrument of nature, giving rise to a beautiful work of art, but in an unconscious way that can't be, a genius can't teach someone else how to paint or sculpt or write great poetry.
It's indeterminate. Yeah, there's an indeterminate notion of that type of judgment. Yeah.
Right. And then Kant says you couldn't have a scientific genius because science is predicated upon clear rules and experimental methods that can be replicated. And you can't just unconsciously participate in the creative power of nature as a scientist because you won't be able to explain what you've experienced to anybody else. And so it can't become universal in the way that we want science to be. You need to be able to provide your method and the logic and the rules and an experimental setup to verify it and all of this. And so Kant said, yes, artistic genius is piercing the veil, and the artist is participating in the sort of formative power of nature, but there's no possibility, at least as far as he could tell, for there to be a scientific genius. Now, Fichte and Schelling, and someone I haven't mentioned yet, Goethe, who was right at the center of all these conversations. Fichte and Schelling wouldn't have had teaching positions at the University of Vienna if it weren't for Goethe, who was the close assistant of the Duke of Weimar and was responsible for sort of managing the affairs of the university and appointing different professors. And so he got Fichte the job there. Mm-hmm. He got Schelling a job there. And Goethe was a close reader of Kant as well, and thought that he was capable of exactly the type of intuitive understanding or archetypal intelligence that Kant was saying humans can't be capable of. And so basically Goethe thought it was almost that he was the proof that it was possible. And he developed his theories of plant morphology and animal morphology and his understanding of color, which was Goethe felt in opposition to Newton's understanding of color. But in any event, Goethe tried to exemplify in his own scientific pursuits the possibility of the type of understanding that Kant forbid. And I think that both Fichte and Schelling and Hegel later looked to Goethe as sort of proof of this possibility, that the cultivated sensibility and cultivated what Goethe called exact sensorial imagination granted us a kind of participatory perception of nature that broke through the Kantian barrier. Now, this is, remains highly controversial. It's totally understandable why neo-Kantians would say, no way. I mean, Goethe was in a 10-year argument with his good friend, the poet Schiller, who was more of a Kantian, and said, Goethe, you're not seeing the archetypal form of the plant. That's an idea that you're projecting or imagining. And Goethe insisted that, no, I'm seeing it in the growth process of the plant, and tried he tried to elaborate his method so that others could come to see as he saw. And so that's basically the pathway through the Kantian thicket to a new mode of perception of the natural world. And I can see how it leaves the Schellingian philosopher vulnerable to criticisms that, like, well, you're presupposing some sort of mystical cognition of the realm of things in themselves that clearly Kant made forbid, and it hasn't really been proven that this is possible. But I would say that if there's a proof of the possibility, it would come through experimenting with the method that people like Goethe articulated and that Schelling elaborated in his philosophical works.
Okay. I guess I'd have a few things that I'd want to say about that. One, again, and I don't mean to again push back, I still think that that's a very descriptive project, because we have to do a little work on why intellectual intuitions are possible. And I'm not sure if Schelling, at least, I haven't read enough about him, if he does give a account of why intellectual intuition does work. The only pathway that I have personally seen within German idealism is from Hegel, at least within the science of logic, because I don't know that, I mean, I know that a little bit better than the phenomenology of spirit, in that just beginning with transcendental arguments, according to Hegel, depending on how you read them. The analytic school kind of reads them as a series of transcendental arguments. I read them as a sort of immanent unfolding of being and the sort of dialectical process of being. The best criticism that I've seen of just kind of getting rid of this idea of transcendental philosophy is beginning with indeterminate immediate being and then seeing how it immanently develops. Because here we have sort of I guess to use some terminology, a sort of flat ontology, if you will. It doesn't assume subjectivity, it doesn't assume objectivity, and in this sense, if we have a beginning truly presuppositionalistly, without any content, without any qualities, without anything, right? That is nothing to contrast being with being, and nothing to basically make this concept derivative from another concept, as in it has no discursivity. It is just immediately known. Then that seems to be, at least in one sense, favorable to a person that wants to start with a presuppositionalist philosophy. Now Hegel, I think, kind of offers that step, and I'm kind of seduced by that. Are you sympathetic to that, or do you think that that's exactly the same thing as an intellectual intuition?
Well, that would be Schelling's later critique of Hegel's beginning point in the science of logic, that, while Hegel's claiming this isn't intellectual intuition, Schelling says it is. You're just dressing it up differently. But I would point back to Fichte, actually. So much of what gets elaborated brilliantly by Hegel was articulated originally by Fichte. Fichte points to our own thinking activity as the site wherein an intellectual intuition is achieved. And he would say that when we say I am to ourselves, right, we are performing an intellectually intuitive act, in the sense that our thinking is the thinking of our I is giving rise to the existence of our I in that act.
It's generative, yeah.
It's generative. And so Fichte is saying that to say I am is to bring together thought and being in a way that Kant forbids, and yet the transcendental unity of apperception is presupposed in Kant's transcendental philosophy. And what Fichte took himself to be doing was trying to find the underlying principle, basically the premise that made Kant's philosophy possible. Mm-hmm. And for Fichte, he didn't think he could prove this formulation to anyone else, because it is really, it's almost a spiritual exercise that he would recommend that people practice. He used to stop his lectures and tell his students to stare at the wall and say, now, okay, represent the wall to yourself. Now, represent yourself representing the wall to yourself. And he would try through these activities of like reflection upon reflection to instigate an experience of the sort that he thought was an intellectual intuition.
Right. I guess if I was to buy into an intellectual intuition of sort, it would be that sort of Fichtean notion of intellectual intuition, but you sort of can demonstrate the I as including itself in every sort of representation or any sort of notion of the empirical subject. So just to kind of break that down for the audience, right? You basically said stare at a wall. You could stare at a painting. You could stare at yourself, and then you could think about yourself staring about the painting, and then you can sort of go through these series of metacognitive acts. And that's infinitely regressive, sort of. You could just, that could continue on forever theoretically. You could just keep on going. But what seems to be instilled in every single one of those images, as you said, is the I that accompanies with them. And not an I that is accompanied in the empirical subject or the empirical demonstration of me viewing these things. It's the I that sees the empirical demonstrations. So I'm sure you are reminded of maybe the same thing, but there's this painting by, the wanderer above the sea of fog who's looking upon sort of the sea. And it's kind of like I think it's kind of shows an image really well of Schelling, Schellingian philosophy or Fichtean philosophy. It's like don't imagine nature, but imagine human being imagining nature, and that's sort of how I take that sort of moment.
Is it Caspar David Friedrich's?
I think so. Yes, I think that's his name. So the immediate I, right, that is presented before any sort of thinking is the idea, and it's generative in the sense that once it thinks about itself, it creates itself. Whereas we tend to think of causation as something that comes prior to itself and then generates the effect. Rather, the effect is its cause, and the cause its effect. You have to also think of this, I think, kind of diachronically. I give some of the lectures that I do online, I sort of give examples of diachronic relationships like this. So imagine, a salt cube, right? And I think this was one of the examples that was listed in the book. Imagine a sugar cube being dissolved in water, and we could say the water is dissolving the sugar cube. But we can also say at the same time, inversely, that the water is becoming saturated by the sugar cube, right? And so, there's a logical relationship right here that's taking place between the two instead of one being prior to the other. And I think that that's sort of the way that maybe Fichte also thought about the I as well, or self-consciousness, so that it sort of generates itself sort of diachronically like that. But maybe I'm mixing too many concepts here together. So yeah, I mean, I just wanted to say, kind of explicate that and sort of agree with you I think that's what Fichte is doing from the little I have read of Fichte. And
yeah, a important clarifying point here is though that Fichte thinks of this intellectual intuition of the I am not as a synthesis of two things that were separated, but as a thesis, so that this isn't a form of synthetic a priori cognition. This is prior to all of that. It's as a priori as the a priori can get. And so it's a thesis, and it's a posit, which is his technical term of art, and it is something that and maybe this will help us get to Schelling. Schelling was concerned that Fichte's transcendental argument about the I, that it was too subjective, and that it left us in this sort of solipsistic prison of our own creation.
I think that's a misunderstanding of Fichte, but yeah, I hear you. I guess you're about to kind of go on to that.
It is a misunderstanding because there's something profoundly relational and intersubjective actually about Fichte's point of view. But nonetheless, what Schelling wanted to do was to say that the I that Fichte believed was at the base of this intellectual intuition is not the human ego, but in fact the absolute itself, which is neither subject nor object, but the ground of each. And so it's as if Schelling was trying to shift the activity that Fichte was realizing out of the subject and into
nature.
Into nature, yeah.
Right.
To say that it's not even a ground; it's more of an abyss. It's groundless.
Sure, yeah.
And so that's the move that Schelling tries to make, and basically, Schelling's move is to say, as he literally says, nature is a priori, right? And his question, rather than being, what must nature be such, or sorry, what must mind be such that nature appears as it does, which would be the Kantian and the Fichtean question, right? Schelling reverses that and says, what must nature be such that mind is possible? What must nature be such that mind could emerge from it? And then that leads him to this organic construction of all of the stages of nature's unfolding to show how, yes, at the end of this sort of a natural process, our kind of cognition and consciousness and freedom and spirituality is possible if this is what nature is and how nature unfolds. And so it just inverts the Kantian project, not to replace the Kantian transcendental project, but to show how we need, this is why Schelling was so interested in Spinoza. He said we need to provide kind of the objective pole to this overly subjectivist philosophy.
Right. I think I definitely agree with your characterization there, that the I in Fichte needs to be viewed as a dynamic relationship between a subject that's sort of generated by the by well, I wouldn't say object, but the rest of the world. I don't know exactly how far along the line we would say that gets to be sort of Spinozian, because we generally tend to view the mind as a sort of finite thing divorced from the world. But in a way, it kind of participates with the rest of the world. As you said, it's this intersubjective, not intersubjective, but interrelationary dynamic thing, to where it could possibly be kind of viewed as a relation to the whole. And that's what the intellectual intuition, I think, is supposed to draw out, is this my relation to everything in a whole. The I also in relation to the not I, and only through these sorts of dynamic accounts can we make sense of the I. This kind of also, I think, and I always say this just about every philosophy stream, it seems, but it's a fun thing to talk about. There's a pretty good argument I kind of heard for why we can get out of this sort of cogito, or this sort of solipsistic subjectivity, and the sort of solution to the problem of other minds. And I thought this sort of perfectly related to at least some of the German idealists, maybe all of them, a little bit more with Fichte and Hegel, in that in order to talk about self-consciousness such as ours, given that we have propositional beliefs, given that we have this unity, this, an internal coherence and all these types of things, given that we have that type of mind, and I'm not just saying a minimal sense of awareness, no understanding whatsoever, I'm not talking about that type of consciousness, I'm talking about a little bit more complex than that. Given if we have that seems to require a language. And if we have language, according to Wittgenstein's private language argument, we need a community. And if we need a community, we need other minds. And so in order to have our own minds, we need a language which needs a community, which needs other minds, and therefore to understand our own minds, we need other minds. And so in the same breath, while we understand our own minds, we're kind of understanding other minds through this use of language, if you will. And that gets us, I think, at least through what I think of a fairly easy, intuitive argument, a sort of solution to the problem of other minds, unless the person just doesn't want to admit that we're communicating. If they don't want to admit that, then I just kind of like, okay, well, I'm sort of done talking at this point. But if we do accept that, then we see that the mind is sort of fundamentally dynamically tied to the rest of the world. It can't just be viewed as a sort of monad, if you will, isolated from the rest of everything else.
Yeah.
And I see that sort of, I guess I see that sort of in Fichte as well. I kind of always draw the analogy that the eye sort of expands outward, feels its limit, then rescinds in. But when it feels its limit, it also understands what it's not, and through what it's not, it understands itself. Kind of how we extend our arms outward, and we know the limitations of our spatial distancing with our body. Kind of the work of the understanding in Fichte works in just about that same sort of analogous way.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's exactly. I mean, it is a I mean, the whole history of philosophy is a history of caricatures of the thinkers that came before you. I mean, it seems that's just how the dialectical engine unfolds. But yeah, to be fair to Fichte, he has this profound way of he points out that a purely active I that met no resistance would never become conscious of itself.
Right.
And so it needs to meet resistance, even if Fichte insists that that check on the absolute I's activity is a posit of the I itself.
Right.
He's still acknowledging the need to meet resistance. And this, he elaborates, basically, he shows how what for Kant was this thing in itself existing in the noumenal realm, for Fichte becomes other minds. Mm-hmm. Right? And that's what provides the limit to grant us consciousness of ourselves. We need mutual recognition in order to become self-conscious. And this is a point that, Hegel would later elaborate brilliantly into the master-slave dialectic and the ways that our minds are not private. We are entangled in and with one another, and come to be aware of ourselves as moral beings in profound relationship with one another. Mm-hmm. And that freedom is something ultimately that needs to be realized in the context of an ethical community. It's not something that, in the way that some libertarians would imagine merely negative freedom, right, that it's just freedom to not be bothered by community or by the state or whatever. Right. It's to be free it presupposes a certain kind of engagement in community, enculturation, and education, Bildung in the German sense, and that all of this is required for freedom to become conscious of itself. You don't become conscious of your freedom if you're stranded on an island as a lone individual.
Yeah, I would say that, and this was why I'm sort of careful to say self-consciousness. I would also say freedom in the sense that you're talking about definitely requires a dynamic relationship with the culture. Although I have been pushed back in certain forms of consciousness, of where like certain people are actually just stranded sort of by themselves, along with animals at least, and you have sort of the concept of feral children or whatever. They never develop a language. Later on, they can't develop a language. They have no actual social communication with other people. Yet we would say that they're probably conscious. I wouldn't say that that person is self-conscious, but I would say that that person is conscious. And so this at least somewhat, I think, invites some levels of the mind, but I wouldn't say all levels of the mind as being private. That, and it seems as though certain... because people also have pushed back on me quite a bit with qualia, and that seems to have some level of privacity. I'm still sort of exploring exactly how much privacity, or if that privacity is just sort of illusion. Because a vast majority of what we talk about, how we know ourselves, ethics, a vast majority of that seems public.
And this is, the example of feral children raised by wolves or what have you is, I think what it brings home is the importance of putting all of this in an explicitly evolutionary context. Ethics, I think there's plenty of examples of that in other species, mammals in particular, who develop a sort of proto sense of justice that you see playing out in their play behavior in particular, where the stronger lion will play fair with the weaker lion, because otherwise there's no game and there's no fun. And so you start to get this sense of ethical community even in the non-human world. And so without language, I think you're right, we don't get the sort of self-consciousness that we would want to preserve for our species. Nonetheless, there's highly elaborate forms of ethical expectation that emerge in the non-human animal
Right.
world, that our sense of morality is a further
Right.
elaboration upon.
Yeah, I would agree if we're going to genetics, which I don't know terribly much about, or I guess just biology. Of course, from the ground up, that has to be dynamic. So the feral children, as you say, they have some sort of dynamic relationship with an animal, something that it can touch, it can grow up with. I mean, we know that children who are deprived from any sort of physical contact, there's actually an experiment done in Russia where they tried to have, I think, a set of like 30 or 40 babies, and then they just wouldn't touch them at all. And they had to stop the experiment because they were dying. They needed sort of contact with something, some sort of, actually flesh-like creature in order to continue living. And so there needs to be more than substance of some sort of water, but they need, literally other individuals to keep living and surviving, which I found found interesting. And of course, I think that everything from the ground up in our biology can't be thought of through an isolated test tube, right? Largely, what biology is going to be understood functionally through. I don't know if you've read the thinker Michael Thompson, through sort of outer context. If you haven't read Michael Thompson, you should, because I think he gives some of the best accounts of what life is. Yeah, he does an analysis of what life is and action theory, and then I haven't read this third section because it's brutally hard, but yeah, the account of life that he gives is very nice.
Is he a philosopher of biology, or is he a
He
biologist, or what?
he's a philosopher within the Pittsburgh School, so he's there
Huh.
with McDowell and Brandom. I think he
Gotcha.
might have just recently got the position there. He hasn't wrote a lot, but he basically thinks that these sort of ways that we generally uh, teach biology in terms of trying to find the category of life by saying it's homeostasis, metabolism, cooperation, organization. These don't work because there's, like replication exists in crystals. Self-organization occurs in certain types of apparently certain types of non-biological things. Transfer of energy, asphalt that intakes the sun could be, does that intake energy for its own use, for its own maintenance or something like that?
Mm.
There's I can't possibly go through all of them. I can't remember, but he kind of goes through a list of why the general categories of life don't work. He basically thinks that the best way of entertaining the aspect of life is through um, normativity that's analyzed through historical natural contexts. So, for example, he kind of gives a good overview. I'm sure you watch the National Geographic, right? Everyone watches David Attenborough, and
Oh, sure.
he gives an account of, like, say, bobcats and how they live, right? So he would say, well, in February they do this, in the winter they do this, in the spring they do this. Look how they nurse their young, right? Well, they nurse their young in a certain type of way, of where the cub kind of mimics the mother and then learns to hunt. There's a certain type of normativity there, right? They're operating under standard contexts, standard norms, if you will, of where we understand that life through these natural historical contexts. And we would say that normativity, that functionality, is different from, say, a caterpillar, right? A caterpillar is just going to go out into the wild as soon as it's born, basically. It doesn't need its mother to sort of rear it and develop its sort of life process. And a lot of things can sort of be understood in this way through these natural historical contexts, as long as we realize that the form of the creature has to be understood through an outer context, through its relation to the whole, right? A group of cells cut off from a body, he says, are just going to functionally act differently than a group of cells tied to the body. And because of that, right, because of this, just because we have absolutely no fucking way of making sense of biology through just a microscope alone, we have to understand it through these dynamic, and I'd say ultimately teleological judgments. Good luck understanding, a group of cells just alone, isolated in a place, right? But as soon as we introduce that dynamism, well, then we introduce a larger whole, right? Then we're no longer talking about monadic properties, we're talking about dynamic properties. And so I think he basically says here, we're dealing with a normativity. Not a normativity of the bobcat ought to rear its young, but that it typically does under standard contexts. That's not to say that we need to introduce certain types of qualifiers, like probabilistically it does this, or ceteris paribus it does that. We can add that, but that would be an extra stipulation just to the normal historical judgments that we, historical natural judgments that we make. That is to say that they just do this under standard contexts. If people want to reply back, well, they don't do that if you put them in Antarctica. Well, sure, but that's not the standard context of where we realize the inner form of a bobcat, right? Then you're just now separating the inner form from the outer form of where it typically is, and you're no longer talking about bobcats in any sort of typical sense. So, anyways.
Yeah. I mean, that all sounds very amenable to me. I think whenever you're talking about a complex adaptive system, context is everything. And I don't know what Michael Thompson thinks about the sort of autopoietic paradigm in the philosophy of biology, or if he brings that up. But it's a perspective that has been elaborated brilliantly by another Thompson, Evan Thompson, who's written a book called Mind in Life, subtitled Biology, Phenomenology, and the Sciences of Mind, where he's trying to connect a lot of the dots actually that we've been discussing. And the importance of history and environmental context. And another example of what you're describing would be those who might try to define life in terms of some sort of genetic replication, thinking of the DNA molecule as in some way like the code that produces a phenotype. And there used to be the sort of central dogma of genetics where DNA is transcribed into RNA, which then gets used to create a protein, as if it's a one-way causal chain, and that we can understand organisms in that way. When the problem is that for DNA to be transcribed into RNA, you already need proteins or enzymes. And so there's a circular causation at work. And if you remove the DNA molecule from a living cell, it's going to degrade very quickly. And the meaning that we think is in a gene disappears entirely outside the context of the living cell and its environment and its history.
Yeah, I would even go and maybe even strengthen that argument for you, in that I agree. I think what you said. I've heard this actually, the same argument from the sort of the philosophy of biology, which by the way is super unappreciated. I mean, process philosophy is super dominant, I think, within the philosophy of biology, or at least a lot of the biology that I work, and I don't see it anywhere else, and it's just always struck me odd. But I think I would strengthen that argument further in basically saying, like, this notion that genetics are predetermining in any sort of sense, or biologically determining what the organism is going to do, can I think sort of be easily disproved by certain types of examples. So what I'm trying to combat here is biological determinism. Richard Luton actually does a really good kind of, I think, analysis of why biological determinism is false within the book, Not in Our Genes. But
yeah,
so what I was going to say is, like, and I've said this before on stream, and I can't remember what exact species of flies this is, but I think it might have been the fruit fly, where we managed to genetically engineer and edit its genes to where we remove eyes actually from the fruit fly, and then only 5 generations later, the eyes actually come back, Well, is it because once we edited the genes that the eyes are no longer like that the eyes are going to forever determine what the fly is going to do? Obviously not. We have some novelties that sort of arise out of nature that presses it backwards in a dynamic relationship into constructing new eyes. And
Hmm.
I just, it's just like nothing about the genes prior to this dynamic account would have testified for the eyes, right? I mean, we needed more. We needed to use again Michael Thompson's phrase, which I've been growing to love, is this greater outer context in order to make sense of it.
Hmm.
And Aristotle, I think, realized this too, that we need this sort of outer context in order to make sense of the life form, I guess. So yes,
Hmm.
but
Yeah, that's awesome. I'm gonna look more into that. I did not know about that example in fruit flies. It's the obviously the genome is a significant sort of memory apparatus for living organisms, but it's part of a network, and it's part of a sort of global process of self-organization, and memory is in a genotypical sense is not limited to just the DNA molecules. There's all sorts of epigenetic forms of memory that even extend beyond the skin boundary of the organism. And
right.
so we really oversimplify things by imagining that genes code for traits or something.
It's an unfortunate byproduct of that terminology that we're used to: coding, hard coding, hard wiring. We tend to think of these as static, fixed entities, which is very odd. No philosopher, I don't even think Aristotle probably thought of organisms in this sort of fixed way, but maybe you could argue for that within substance ontology. Um,
Hmm.
but what was I going to say? Sorry, I'm kind of I'm losing kind of a track of thought of my mind.
No, it's fine. We've kind of reached a point of asking where do we go from here. I mean, we've covered a lot of territory. I think philosophy of biology is, as you mentioned, a great example of the applications of process philosophy and its relevance to the natural sciences. And I think someone like Whitehead allows us to push that ontology further, and to make some sense out of what is
I'm sorry, which
usually
thinker?
Whitehead.
Oh, okay, okay, yeah,
Yeah, we haven't talked much Whitehead yet.
yeah, yeah.
But he allows us to apply a process ontology to our understanding of physics and quantum theory in particular, which I think is so for a century now continues to confound almost all attempts to make any sense of it. Uh, the equations work great. We can make predictions that are extremely accurate, and yet nobody has any idea what it means. And I think
Sure.
Whitehead's process ontology and granting a place for potential in nature, I
Uh-huh.
think helps us really move that conversation in quantum theory forward, so that yeah, we can begin to do natural philosophy again and actually make sense in human terms of what the hell is going on at the quantum level.
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously, people are going to say that the reason why we haven't managed to reduce all of biology is because we just haven't had the equations yet within physics, and we haven't, figured out how chemistry works just well enough and how particle physics works well enough to explain these sorts of life forms. I always find that type of reply, though, Matt, sort of really, really unsatisfying. That just seems like, if anything, a sort of a science of the gaps, or like I guess a particle physics of the gaps. Like just because it hasn't, it needs to, right? Um,
Mhm.
Instead of just simply endorsing some sort of like scientific pluralism about like, okay, well, this domain of science, until you have proven that it can be reduced, just is sua generis. It stands on its own until you have proven it. And I've talked to some friends, and they're like, I mean, we can't even figure out the dynamics of anything more complex the, than a hydrogen atom, basically, in terms of being able to explain any elements more complex than that through like what's called like the Dirac equations or the Dirac equations. I can't remember exactly how it's pronounced, but one of my friends,
Dirac.
Yeah, Dirac equations. What was basically saying there are huge problems within science with underdetermination and irreducibility of what we can do sort of with equations. I know David Batterman also sort of made a book that I won't be able to understand in this lifetime since I don't study physics, but about how like even rainbows are sort of irreducible because we have multiple theories of light, and neither of the two that he mentions can sort of make sense of how rainbows come about.
Yeah, I think. Yeah, go ahead.
No. Yeah, I don't have anything more to say there for now.
Well, just in response to the sort of promissory reductionism of life to physics, I think I'm really interested in the theoretical biologist Robert Rosen and his argument that, and he's here building on Schrodinger, actually, whose book "What Is Life" kind of set molecular biology on a course of study that led to the discovery of DNA. But Schrodinger said some other profound things, like that understanding biology would require a new physics. And the way that Rosen cashes this out is to say that physics and our understanding of the physical world is too specific to grasp the biological realm in its self-organization, and that actually the sorts of principles that are at play in the biological realm are the more generic principles by which we need to understand the rest of nature. And so rather than a reduction to physics, he thinks that a deeper understanding of life is actually going to change the way we understand the physical world. Mm-hmm. And that, you know, so much of our of the physics community in its search for a theory of everything is they've just presupposed that life and mind are kind of epiphenomenal and have no relevance to the understanding of fundamental physics. And so we're left in a situation where I guess they're imagining they could explain everything without even mentioning the fact that there is an explainer there who figured that out. Right? So in other words, Kant would say you haven't provided the condition for the possibility of physics in your supposed theory of everything. And so I think as we study life and we grasp its intrinsically processual and teleological dimensions, I think it's going to force us to expand our conception of the physical world. Mm-hmm. We're not talking about teleology like an argument from design, like some sort of a creationist imposition of forms from heaven or something. We're talking about an immanent purposiveness that, you know, Whitehead would think of in terms of the aims or the lures that are embedded in nature in the form of potentials that are not directly measurable or weighable, you know, in a physical sense, because, you know, it's grasping that old Aristotelian distinction between actuality and potential, and recognizing that potentials have a role to play, not as like the future reaching back to the past, but as the present anticipating possibilities in light of the past. Sure, so it's a different kind of teleology. And I think it's when you start looking at, like, in the study of light and quantum theory, the principle of least action, very hard to understand the meaning of that, which is at the base of particle physics and everything, without teleology, without understanding it as some sort of a purposive act. And there's a sort of organic wholeness to it, and a seeking out of the most ideal, you know, way, the most ideal pathway for energy to realize its trajectory. And so I think we seem to me to be right on the verge of that kind of a paradigm shift, and I hope I live long enough to see it come to fruition.
Hold on, just replying to a text real quick. It's certainly so important. I don't know much about the theories of light, so I'll definitely buy into what you have to say there. For now, but I do agree with what the sort of the formal principles that you've kind of laid out for the for biology. For biology and some of the other things that you mentioned in the sciences. I did want to just briefly, since one of my one of the people who are viewing it, also a friend, had a question for you. We can
Uh-huh.
clarify this even further if you wanted to. He said, "Can you ask Matthew if he has thought about how identity concepts work in process-based systems? If you have an answer to that, or if you need to ask him what he means exactly by identity."
Well, I assume, and he can correct me if I'm wrong, but I assume by identity he's referring to, the problem for process philosophers is how do you account for stability? How do you account for the endurance of form? Whereas for the substance philosopher, the problem is change. How do you account for change and transformation? And so in Whitehead's scheme, although he's often called a process philosopher and his main text is called Process and Reality, he is actually trying to balance these two really deep intuitions that the philosophical tradition has arrived at, that there is permanence and there is change. And the question is, how do you get them? How do you integrate these? And for Whitehead, identity, or the sense of like our ability to recognize an object. We see. I parked my car yesterday, and I know that when I go out, I'll see that car again, and it's the same car. Or you think of Plato's account of the ship of Theseus. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, but
No,
it's
you are.
the
Just
idea
start.
that Theseus. There's a ship that you replace it piece by piece until every single plank has been replaced with a new plank. And is it the same ship? Well, in the biological world, I don't know the exact number, but some number of years, maybe a decade, every atom in our bodies has been cycled through. There may be a few little places where there's more of a sense of the conservation of the same atomic forms in our bodies. But for the most part, we are a flow of matter and energy. And what is permanent about us is a form that is not, strictly speaking, physical. The physical part of us is constantly in motion. And so for Whitehead, this is why he is at least a reformed Platonist. He has this category of existence that he calls eternal objects. And these for him are pure potentials. And the actual world is ingressing these potentials in order to take on definite form. And it's his attempt to strike a balance between these two deep intuitions we have of something that is permanent. We can recognize, even in the case of human personalities, like we recognize that there's something continuous about who we are, even though over the course of our lives we're experiencing new things, overcoming psychological challenges, and Whitehead says no person thinks twice, no thinker thinks twice. We're constantly becoming new, and yet there is some enduring characteristic about us. We have a personality or a style that can be recognized as who we are. And so, I don't know that this is a elaborate enough explanation to really grasp Whitehead's philosophy, but as a process philosopher, he deals with identity by talking about the ingression of forms, which are, unlike Plato, they're not, for Whitehead, these forms are not the preeminent actualities. They're not actualities at all in Whitehead's scheme. They're merely potentials. They're deficient in actuality, and they don't cause or do anything. They don't act. For Whitehead, the other pole of his system is actual occasions. Actual occasions are the only reasons for anything, but actual occasions, in order to experience anything definite, need to draw upon this realm of potential, this realm of eternal objects, in order to give definite characteristics to their experience. So that's how I approach that. And I realize there's a lot of questions that probably raises, in addition to the one about identity. But yeah, identity is a formal thing. It's not in the matter of which we are made. It's in the form that gives shape to the material process.
Mm-hmm. He had a follow-up question. So do you think commitment to identity of conceptualization of objects in a pure process-based system necessitates some kind of Platonic or form/content-based distinction in your fundamental ontology? I can also give you the, I could write it down for you in the PM as well.
So I think what Whitehead tries to overcome these dualities, whether between form and content, or concept and percept, or form and matter. He wants to understand things. I think the easiest way to get at it is to think in terms of subject and object, rather than these being entirely distinct categories for Whitehead. They're actually phases in a unifying process, such that in each process of actualization in Whitehead's scheme, there's a vector of experience whereby you move from the already perished objective world, so that, in other words, the world that is no longer immediately experiencing anything, its subjectivity has perished into objects. These objects grow together into the next moment of experience. And so the new subject emerges out of perished objects, has develops a perspective on those objects, enjoys its experience, and then perishes itself to become an object. So there's a movement from objects to novel subject to new object. And so rather than there being any sense of separation between a subject that has conceptual knowledge of objects, there's more of a processual account whereby we're constantly moving through phases of objectivity to novel subjectivity, and then perishing into a new object, or what Whitehead calls a superject. It's a term that he coins. And so let me reread this question to make sure that I'm addressing exactly what's being asked here.
Just for your convenience as well, I'm gonna give you the link basically to the Twitch stream, so you can kind of like,
Okay.
Just view the questions as they come. If you wanted to answer it or interject in the midst of our conversation, I don't mind. I like answering the audience's questions sometimes, although they've been a little bit less frequent these days, and people just kind of tune in. So yeah, there's the link, and you can kind of see it in the screen. Just
Gotcha.
make sure to turn down the volume.
I think the answer to this question, I was dwelling more on the form content distinction, whereby what is it's kind of a Kantian distinction that doesn't translate into Whitehead's scheme anymore. But in terms of whether a commitment to identity of conceptualization of objects is possible or whether that requires some kind of Platonic realism, yes. Whitehead is a reformed Platonist, and he does think, both because of his he was a mathematician, and I think, I haven't seen the latest polling, but it seems that most mathematicians adhere to some kind of Platonism, just because of their experience of discovering mathematical relations, not feeling like they're simply creating them using discursive signs, but that they're actually using those signs as a scaffolding in order to intuit something real that's beyond our normative use of language. But also, Whitehead thought that understanding permanence in nature required making reference to a realm of eternal objects. But as I mentioned earlier, he inverts Plato's hierarchy, whereby Plato thought that the most real thing was the forms, whereas Whitehead's saying, no, it's actual experience that's most real, and the forms are deficient in actuality, but their role is to provide definiteness, to allow us to recognize the same entity across moments in our actual experience.
Looks like he has he keeps, there's a few other questions right there. I don't know if you can see the chat room.
Let me pull this up, yeah. I might have to mute this so it doesn't echo. Yeah. Okay. Oh, I don't know that it shows me the questions that have already been asked, or I have to watch this advertisement before it shows them to me.
Oh yeah. Just you'll have to watch the advertisement brief. But that's only like 15 seconds. But yeah.
Yeah. Oh, TurboTax advertisement. Got to do my taxes. Yeah, I think I can hang out for 10 or 15 minutes, and then
You have to head out here.
I think I got to get some lunch in me.
Sure. Yeah. No problem.
All right, there we are. I'm just asking the general question about whether or not being a process philosopher requires you to need to have the distinction in order to make the system distinct, in the sense that fundamental distinction requires identity. Conditions and identity is a discrete relation. Process philosophy entails intervals. Yeah, so it's always, I wonder if this, I can't see the name of this person, but I wonder to what extent they have any background in Whitehead, because it would help me figure out how to approach answering the question, how much jargon I'm allowed to use. But
Ancient Shower has read a little bit of Whitehead, just a tiny bit. So yes.
Yeah, I got that sense from what he says about discreteness. So Whitehead is a kind of atomist, though his atoms are drops of experience rather than simple substances. And while it might seem that at the level of our conscious experience, there's sort of a stream of consciousness in William James's terms, Whitehead thinks that this is actually, this continuity is constructed by historical roots of these discrete actual occasions of experience that, as I was describing earlier, arise by inheriting the past, introduce novelty in their experience of the present, and then perish to then themselves influence the future occasion. They're saying this question is not specific to Whitehead, but I would myself as a Whiteheadian answer it in Whitehead's terms.
I think he's just asking the question of whether or not we should index this type of thing exclusively to Whitehead, or if it can be extended to general process-based ontologies. Yeah, that was his last question, basically.
Yeah, I don't think so. A lot of process-oriented thinkers, in particular, I think the way that Dupree and Nicholson carry forward aspects of Whitehead's thought, they want to leave behind his realm of eternal objects and the function of ingression, and they want to definitely leave behind his theology and God's function in the universe. And I think that's a perfectly worthy project that makes sense in the context of scientific research, where you want to minimize metaphysical presuppositions. But in Whitehead's scheme, in order to understand identity, in order to understand the nature of any enduring object at the mesoscale of our everyday experience, he would say we do need to make reference to a realm of eternal objects that would ingress in order to provide those enduring characteristics that we are capable of recognizing. I'm not entirely sure what a process philosopher who did not adhere to some sort of Platonic realism in this sense, what they would say in regards to how we're capable of recognizing the identity of an object across different moments of experience. I think that would be a problem that would need to be addressed.
I also have sort of issues. I guess I'm kind of sympathetic towards McDowell and Brandom and sort of Hegel. But I guess Brandom sort of coins this term a little bit more, and he calls it conceptual realism. And then McDowell kind of calls this naturalized Platonism. of where concepts, which I think also translate to forms, sort of exist literally within the world instead of just being sort of projections of the mind or being sort of internal characteristics of the minds. And the, and also they think that there's a sort of natural normativity in the world, that is, things operate in terms of principles, or norms, I guess, if you will, also within the world.
Mhm.
I generally think that these principles can, because their norms have capacities for failures, they're sort of hypothetical necessities instead of strict necessaries, I guess. So I don't know if you agree with that, or you're kind of unfamiliar with McDowell and Brandom.
I've dabbled, but I think there's nothing in Whitehead's scheme. There's nothing necessary about the structure of these forms, in the sense that there would be some sort of um, you know law coming from an ideal realm that's determining the shape that actual experience takes.
Law-like, though. I wouldn't say it's actually a nomological necessity, but I
But
would.
normative.
Yeah, but normative. So
Yeah.
normativity, yeah, I mean, because normativity implies failure, certain antecedent conditions or certain types of interacting qualities can stop that type of normative behavior. So I mean, obviously, like animals such as bobcats, caterpillars, or any organism, if you dip them into a vat of acid, right, they're not going to have any of the normative functions that they do, but they still have a dispositional tendency, right? A habit, if you will, of acting these certain types of ways, and that's why I wouldn't divorce the normativity from the actual world, because I think they are sort of approaching these Platonic norms or these Platonic concepts, but we shouldn't understand them as law-like in the sense that they always follow these sets of rules that are prescribed onto them without, in the same way that, like, we tend to think of the second law of thermodynamics as always taking place at all places in time.
Mm-hmm.
I know that you, when I was viewing, I only saw about half the video with, I think you said David Long or whatever his name is. You basically kind of view nature as being habit forming and habit inducing, I guess, instead of necessarily having also nomological necessities. Um, I'm I'm sympathetic to that. I think that that's sort of what in analytic philosophy they call the powers view. Stephen Mumford kind of offers that view, and I'm all game for that. What would you say to things like just gravity or the second law of thermodynamics, or things that do just seem to work in a law like matter? And what seems to be going on isn't that these are just habits, that these are actual necessities that we just can't inductively get to, just because there's always going to be some sort of indetermination with empirical inductive claims, right? Just that sort of Humean, pushback. But we could see that there's this sort of necessity, and we're approaching that necessity, and it's not just a habit, but something that is there. I mean, would you just toss that out? And
I think that the universe that we live in is a profoundly historical, has a profoundly historical nature, and that what initially was highly contingent becomes increasingly law-like or habitual over the course of the evolution of that universe, because there's increasing constraint on possibility.
mm-hmm.
And so the idea of laws, or even the what gets framed as a problem in terms of the fine tuning of the universe, such that life could emerge, or even any stable matter, that there's a very small degree of wiggle room in terms of the fundamental constants.
Right.
um, I think that a Whiteheadian, or we could think in terms of Charles Saunders Peirce again, who also thought of nature as habit forming. Their solution to this problem would be to say that these constants and these fundamental uh, laws they co-evolved with one another, so that there's no surprise that they would be finely tuned, because they were never independently introduced, like as if a divine being just made a couple of decisions and said this law, this law, this law, just so that they were perfectly calibrated. It's a very kind of deist understanding of law that seems to reign, at least in the popular discussions of physics to this day. Whereas if you have a more organic and evolutionary understanding of the emergence of order in a profoundly historical universe, it starts to be less of a mystery why there would be such a sense of synchronization, if you will, in these fundamental constants. And I think entropy is it's such a profound mystery. I've been contemplating the nature of entropy and its relationship to complexification in the natural world and the biological world in particular. And it seems to me that it is one way of thinking about what Kant and Schelling were talking about in terms of the expansive and contractive forces at the base of nature, is to see entropy as one of the most primordial expansive forces that there is in the universe, and that it's rather than it being a source of degradation and disorder and all these horrible things that we contemplate about the heat death of the universe and whatever, it's actually profoundly generative,
right?
And it's almost teleological. It's the one place
in a local
physics that's directional.
Yes, for sure, it's directional. Yeah, it's generative.
There's an asymmetry, in other words.
Yes, if I understand you right, although I don't want to talk too much about the asymmetry of time because I don't know too much about it, although I know that there are a lot of people like David Albert who are very sympathetic towards time asymmetry and things like that. But I think the generative quality of nature and life seems to be only sort of local. Otherwise, there is a sort of tending disorganization of the universe sort of acting in, well, disorganized, right? Just less and less energy sort of spreading out, if you will. But yeah, I mean, I do think especially life, there's a sort of local organization, if you will, of things doing things in a dynamic relationship through this sort of chaos as well. So there is a sort of identity, if you will, between chaos and non-chaos. Although I think in the end it seems as though that what ends up winning is heat death, if you will, and then ultimately nothing, which is very strange for a sort of, I think, overall teleological picture. I know we don't have much time right here today, but I also maybe I wanted to talk about panentheism because I'm a panentheist and you seem to be a panentheist yourself, panentheist in the Hegelian Schellingian sense. So that would be also an interesting conversation. But when we get into theodicy and theology and what exactly is going on in the sort of big picture of God's plan, or at least nature's plan, if people don't like the spooky sounds of the word God. So
yeah, well, I'll just say that in a Whiteheadian scheme, even God doesn't know where we're going.
and neither, well, I mean, until later neither does Hegel's system in the science of logic. The dialectic does not move teleologically. It moves immanently through a series of self-dialectical movements that cannot be predicted in advance. If they could be predicted in advance, right, then it would be presuppositionalist. And if nature could be predicted in advance, then we wouldn't have the problem of induction, right? So these, it's just like, it just seems like that is always kind of made intuitive sense. I did want to say one thing, and then we can kind of wrap it up, and you can go. And these are just more personal questions. How much? Because I've been struggling less and less myself as I've been kind of reading a little bit more in pushing the idea of conceptual content into the world, conceptual realism, teleology. But you said you kind of struggled to have a lot of success within a lot of contemporary philosophy. What type of, I guess, what type of problems exactly do you face, if you don't mind me asking? And do you think it's a level of incredulity on the opposition? Do you think that they just don't understand the concepts, the history they need? What exactly do you think is the overall problem of philosophy and why it's so unsympathetic to process ontology, Schelling, Pananthism, and conceptual realism, and these sorts of more, I guess, Platonic themes, if you will.
Well, I mean, at the risk of sounding cliche, it's like it's difficult to find a way to ask the big questions when we're so siloed into different disciplines. I mean, even philosophy as a discipline is so fragmented into different specializations, different schools of thought that want nothing to do with one another, and have very little understanding of the sorts of discourses that go on. Like, I'm thinking of analytic and continental thought. I tend to hang out in the American pragmatist tradition a lot, which confounds that easy division between continental and analytic. But I think the main problem I face is the challenge of disciplinarity, which on the one hand is super important because you need to specialize in order to know what you're talking about. On the other hand, the more specialized you become, the less able you are to talk to anyone else. And so the big challenge is finding a rigorous way to be inter and transdisciplinary so that we can do cosmology, do natural philosophy in the classical sense of really trying to connect all the dots. No one can be an expert in everything, but I think there's such and I don't know if this is a result of a super competitive academic job market or what, but there's so much competition among academic philosophers to, write the next big book or have the next big breakthrough that conferences are hosted about or whatever. And there's very little in the way of collaboration and cooperation and earnest, learning from and with one another. So I think we desperately need a more collaborative attitude in academia among philosophers, so that, and I think the sciences have more of a built-in mechanism for that almost forces collaboration, because people are trying to build on one another's research, and even when they're competing, they're still serving the end of, like, running this experiment again and making sure that this is, the adequate that the experiment works, so they can test each other. Whereas in philosophy, there's just so much wiggle room for interpretation and whatnot, that it's harder for our competitiveness to lead to a global advance in the field of understanding,
Yeah.
So I think those are some of the issues I run into.
Yeah. That seems very holistic, I think, in terms of some of the problems. I definitely agree with the overt specialization. One of the types of problems that I think is represented by the contemporary era is the sort of exit from very systematic philosophies. Like, we don't have very super duper huge systematic philosophies like Hegel or Schelling or Heidegger or Husserl anymore, especially Hegel and Aristotle, I think, which are probably the two biggest systematic philosophers I can think of. Contemporary society is just not very sympathetic towards these types of projects because they seem so vast and so big that you enter into this sort of bigger picture that can kind of swallow you whole, and nobody can possibly be that smart, so no one should even attempt to be that smart. And it's unfortunate because then we never get quite the same type of philosophy as we used to. And I don't mean to be a cane thumper and just basically say let's return to the good old days or anything like that. I don't think the good old days ever really existed. But God, I certainly don't think that this era that we're living in is the pinnacle of philosophy, and especially it seems to be very dominated by naturalistic philosophy, materialistic philosophy, very reductive approach. One of my heroes basically kind of, I think, coined the term pretty well. It was by Ian McGilchrist. We live in a time of nothing buttery. So, the mind is nothing but, chemicals, which is nothing but, particles. And what we ultimately, I think, come to the conclusion with is that we need to just get rid of this sort of sense that everything is nothing but something else, but everything seems to sort of have, in one sense or another, something irreducible about it and can just kind of stand on its own ground. Yeah. So
Yeah,
go ahead.
I appreciate, Ian McGilchrist is someone that I enjoy thinking with as well. And I know he's got a new,
Book coming
very
out, yeah.
fat book coming out where
Yeah.
he's drawing on Whitehead. And
Oh, you know him as
I'm
well.
very much, yeah, I'm very much looking forward to seeing how he carries forward his last book.
Um,
On the right and left brains. And I think part of what you're pointing to is the need for more of a holistic, intuitive kind of right-brained understanding
yeah.
that doesn't give you all the details and all the logical connections to prove the arguments, but it gives you that context wherein you're able to make sense of the world, that in our fragmentary age where there's just so much knowledge out there, but very little wisdom, very little understanding of what all the information means and how to make it useful, to how to make it contribute to human flourishing and the survival of life on planet Earth.
Right. It's
So,
it's definitely a problem. I'm glad you know who Ian McGilchrist is, by the way. He's actually one of the big reasons why I got into philosophy when I read his Master and the Emissary back like basically 7 years ago when I was an undergraduate. So it really, I mean, it's so clear, it's so great, and I'm also sort of knowledgeable that he's writing a process ontology book. He actually allowed me to. I mean, maybe you've had the same dialogue as I do. He allowed me to see some of his book and the sections on Schelling, and it was just like it sort of spun me into the right direction as well, because he thinks that Schelling is probably the most brilliant thinker that has ever existed, according to him, which is some large words, and that guy is just massive in terms of the amount of irrigation he has and just information that he has, and so yeah.
Yeah, as it happens, I was sent a recording of a recent dialogue that he had with Rowan. Is it Rowan Williams? I think he's the Archbishop of the Anglican Church. They just had a dialogue, and someone in the audience was like, What do you think about this?" So they sent me the recording of it, and I'll probably be posting a video later today or the next couple of days, reflecting on what he says specifically about process theology and a kind of processual panentheist God. And Rowan Williams, kind of more orthodox in his view of God, was pushing back. And so I look forward to engaging in that exchange. And you and I will have to do another conversation where we can focus on issues like that, because I think we'd have fun.
Yeah, definitely. So I'm gonna thank you for being on for about 2 hours and about 10 minutes right here. I'm definitely gonna try to let you go now, since everyone needs to eat. I really appreciated the conversation. Hopefully, sometime in the future we can have this again, Matthew. It's very I'm very delighted to be able to talk to you. We have a lot of sympathies towards each other's philosophies, I think, and it's a very good direction to go to with you about talking some of these things, because they're informative for me. I know less about German idealists. I really don't know anything about Whitehead, so it's good to hear about that. As I'm giving these kind of closing statements, feel free for one last thing, just to kind of tell us, if you wanted to talk about any of your books, your projects, anything that you wanted to tell the audience, so they kind of come to you, and then we'll wrap it from there.
Yeah. If anyone's interested in Whitehead, I've tried to write a short book that serves as a introduction to someone that doesn't have a tremendous amount of background necessarily in the history of philosophy, though if you do, you'll grasp even more. It's called Physics of the World Soul, Whitehead's Adventure in Cosmology. And you can find a PDF of it on my blog, footnotes-to-plato.com. And I'm always up for dialogue. Feel free to message me or email me. I'm on Twitter more often than I should be. Thou art that is my handle there, and I do a fair amount of philosophizing in 140 characters, or what do they give us? 280 characters or less now. So that's where you can find me.
Okay, excellent. Well, I definitely hope to talk to you sometime in the future. But thank you for being with us today, Matthew. Until next time, you have a good one.
Thanks, Marty. It's been fun. I look forward to the next time.
All right. All right, guys. I hope everyone enjoyed today's stream as much as I did, because that was one of my favorite conversations so far. I figured it might be because me and Matthew basically come from the same sort of tradition of thinkers that we both really appreciate. You know, someone like Schelling and Hegel and all the various kind of problems that spin out of that. So yeah, thanks for everyone for kind of joining me here today. I'll look at here briefly in the chat room to see if there's any sort of questions or comments, and then I'll be ending the stream probably within the next 20 minutes. I say that, sometimes I don't. Sometimes I get overwhelmed by the questions and get interested. So a systematic project has always seemed important to me. Clam said, tried to make sense of everything, make an explanation in one area, doesn't contradict your theory everywhere else, rather than looking at things as these individual problems able to be separated. Well, it's hard because, yeah, sure. Well, it's hard because who's going to pay someone to work on that? Yeah, I mean, it's always the problem with some of the types of things that we're thinking about right here is that it's definitely hard to get funded for any of these types of things, but yeah. Are we gonna get an OF plug or nah? I don't know what OF stands for. And that is the link right there that Calm just posted. Yeah, I'll post the links to Dr. Segall's website on my YouTube video in the future. But you could probably just find him on Google if you just look up Matthew Segall, and you could probably, yeah, like, you know, and then add the word philosophy. You could definitely find that. But I'll for sure add his link to our YouTube video that I'll post tomorrow. Do you think Hegel has any good criticisms of Schelling? It's really hard to say Build the Wall 2016 because, I mean, the only one that I actually have heard is the one that Matthew just kind of brought over into the conversation, is that, well, no, I guess I've heard of two. The one that, you know, he's using intellectual intuitions regardless within the beginning of his philosophy. And that may be the case, that he is using an intellectual intuition. Although I do know that Holgate's kind of fights back on this in his introduction to the science of logic, and doesn't think that he does actually pull an intellectual intuition in that context. For those of you who don't know what an intellectual intuition is, it's basically it's supposed to go against Kant's philosophy, and specifically what's called the discursivity thesis in Kant. So the discursivity thesis in Kant is basically just that age-old quote that concepts without intuitions are blind, and intuitions without concepts are empty. That in order to have any sort of knowledge at all about anything, at least theoretical knowledge, we need both receptivity, the world showing us through our senses what exists in terms of raw, immediate content, and that being synthesized with the concepts of understanding to give that content form. However, and right here, insofar as we have intuitions, we're only talking about sensible intuitions. However, some people want to fight back on it and say that we have intellectual intuitions, that we, at some points, when we have actual understanding, we don't need sensible content in order to generate that knowledge. And so people like Schelling basically think, or people like Fichte, I guess, start out with, think that, well, the eye doesn't need any sort of sensible cognition in order to generate this sort of immediate intellectual intuition of the eye. But there might be certain other things that kind of work that way. So one could argue against Hegel, like Schelling did, that the beginning of the science of logic is a sort of intellectual intuition. It's this non-discursive, immediate apprehension of being qua being itself. So I think Schelling's other criticisms of Hegel don't work. Yeah. Can you explain how you understand pantheism and perhaps Hegel's panentheism? Yeah, I can give you a sort of summary of at least the prior, not so much the latter. Hegel's panentheism is something I wouldn't feel comfortable with explaining completely. But the idea here is that there is a sort of ontological parsimony. That is, when we talk about ontology, we talk about the study of being or the study of nature. That both God and nature have to be of the same ontological parsimony. That is to say that they are one and the same thing. Not reducible to each other, but ultimately one and the same thing. And we tend to think that if something is one and the same thing, it has to be reducible. It's not quite that, but I think these are orthogonal positions, if you will. So for example, or not for example, but to kind of get into that type of picture, the picture that God is nature and nature is God, isn't just basically saying that God is the same thing as the material universe. That's sort of a further misunderstanding. That's just pantheism. The idea is that God is the sort of form or the spirit of nature such that it gives nature the capacity of a certain type of teleological projection, a certain type of way, a formal way of being functionally, or ways of sort of purposefully fulfilling itself. And that's what we would call sort of spirit, form, or soul. Why do we need this? Why do we need purposefulness? Well, I mean, some of the arguments that we've gone over is basically without purposefulness, without form, you couldn't make sense of things like consciousness or biology, right? And some would then argue that you can't even make sense of the world period without purposefulness or forms. And that forms can't just be these sorts of empty abstractions, formal principles that Kant kind of laid out. That relationality, causality, quantity, any types of forms, especially space and time, are structured within reality. And furthermore, other types of forms, like teleological forms, are structured actually really in reality as like sort of Platonic naturalized structures. So that's the type of God that I'm talking about, one whose purposefulness is immanently realized within nature. I use the word immanent because it's not transcendent. It's not a God that exists outside of nature, sort of giving it purpose, but rather it's like an acorn sort of becoming an oak tree, a sort of inner potency becoming actualized, to use Aristotelian jargon. And eventually, there's this sort of dialectical process of spirit unfolding itself in nature. It creates complexity through time, and eventually reaches the point of self-consciousness, which we call the human being because we have consciousness. And so we can say that God created ourselves in order to understand ourselves, or the universe, since we are part of the universe. And so we're not necessarily separated from God, no surprise there. I've already, basically said there's an ontological parsimony that we're equipping ourselves with. But yeah, I mean, it would be these types of things, basically. So I hope that answers the question to some extent. And I take that to be synonymous with some of Schelling's panentheism, a little bit less sure about Hegel's, but I think it would probably go around that structure. Do you mean the night where all cows are black criticism? Well, that criticism would be on Schelling, of where we basically envision a being that has no differentiation. So the idea, that famous quote where the night where all cows are black. What does that mean? It means something like, well, okay, if we're committed monists, then we basically say that everything is alike. That means there is no differentiation. If all cows are black and the night is black, then we can't, how do we even know there's cows, right? And there's no qualities to separate the blackness of the night from the blackness of the cows. We have this univocity that just everything is the same, but yet we see plurality. How is such a thing possible? Well, it's not possible. We have to envision one in the many and the many in one. We can't just have just one or just the many. We have to view the one as sort of fundamentally contrasting itself. But when we contrast itself, we can't view that as now being external to the system, but internal to the system itself. The contrast is sort of, if you will, is an imminent breaking of itself. So what is an example of an imminent breaking? Well, I mean, one really big thing that we covered in this discussion is subjectivity itself, right? If we imagine a flat ontology where no subject or object yet exists, no distinction between world and object, that would be flat. Eventually, subjectivity would arise. How would it arise from itself? By contrasting itself from the rest of the world. And that's kind of where we invent the discourse of subjectivity. It's when it contrasts itself, it breaks apart from the rest of reality and sort of creates a plurality, or at least in this sense, a dualism. But is that a real distinction, or is that a conceptual distinction, right? It's not a real distinction, it's a conceptual distinction, so this obviously has that same ontological parsimony that we see in Spinoza and Hegel and Schelling. So yes. Oh yeah, that is Hegel's criticism of Schelling. Basically, the all knights are black. Where all cows are black. We can't just have that super duper notion of ontological parsimony. We need particularity and individuality, and we need to see how all of these seemingly contradictory notions, or at least if you don't want to read Hegel as embracing contradictions, but just contraries, at least these contraries that we have between the night and the dark and the subject and its other, being and nothing, how these come together, if you will, and share a relationship with each other. Hegel calls this the sort of speculative judgment, or a sort of speculative movement of where there's a unity in opposites. And that's something that I buy into quite a bit, is the notion of unity in opposites, right? So in order to talk about affirmation, we need to talk about at the same time negation. In order to talk about subjectivity, we need to know what is not subjectivity, namely its other. In order to talk about being, right, we need to know its negation, which is nothing, so on and so forth. So there's a debate whether those are contraries or actual contradictions, so I'll let you guys make up your mind there, but I don't think there's much at stake. Pantheism is hard for me to make sense of. Yeah, I mean, you'd have to look at Spinoza's system for pantheism. But he's basically saying that, the various attributes and modes within God are not real distinctions when it comes to preserving or subsuming them under the universal or univocal nature of the one substance. Is that kind of God superdeterminism, predestination? No, actually. So another thing that process ontology does is that it offers a really good sort of perspective or an analysis of trying to incorporate freedom back into nature. So at every point within nature, the future is not yet determined. It's rather determining. So God isn't ahead of himself in terms of what will necessarily occur, but is constantly making choices based on the imminent criterion that he's dealing with in nature. So he's basically, in the same way that human beings are projecting themselves into the future, that is, I think about all sorts of things like I want to become a doctor, I want to become, I don't know, a lawyer, a teacher, a professor. Right? We have these images in our mind, and then we might say this is the same thing as they're being potent in our mind as forms, as idealized forms, and we actualize them. Well, in the same way, nature sort of wants to actualize a certain potent form, an invisible form, and then also bring it into life, right? And at sort of every point, it doesn't have a necessity towards it of what it's going to do, but it does have a sort of calculation, if you will, a dispositional urge. So there's no superdeterminism or predestination or necessitarianism or anything like that. This conception of God is sort of radically kind of divorced from these sorts of concerns of where we get into forms of Lutheranism or Calvinism, well, particularly Calvinism of predestination. So yeah, guys. Do you ever read Freud? Kind of reminds me of the Lacanian short circuit. I've read Freud. I haven't read Lacan. So yeah, I mean, I've read, but so I don't know what the short circuit is that you have in mind right there. I do know that panentheism of the type of variety that I'm talking about is sort of unfavorable, or isn't really even talked much about, and that's why I kind of like bringing it into the foreground. It seems like this sort of mystical tradition that's kind of pseudo intellectual, but really I think it makes a lot more sense than at least a classic theistic notion of God. And if you're very unconvinced by a completely reductive materialistic picture, then it seems like a preferable alternative. And it might not be the same thing as panpsychism. It seems to be debated whether or not that's the same thing as panpsychism. The behavior of nature is the tendency of God, yeah. So, I mean, to use a old quote by Schelling, nature is visible spirit. Spirit is invisible nature. So what nature does empirically is supposed to be a demonstration of its inner principles, of its form, and its form is supposed to be the invisible form of empirical nature. What is seen as the empirical object is a product of an inner productivity, of an inner process. And that's why we're process ontologists, is that we think that what gives rise to the empirical world, or these series of objects, is a process immanent within it. And processes always have to be cashed out temporally, through extended periods of time, through a certain type of thing that cannot be cashed out within one discrete empirical moment. It has to be viewed continuously, and it has to be viewed as the conditions of possibility for object simpliciter. So yeah. And we call that tendency God. So yeah. And if the next question is why call that God, that's just a semantical dispute. That's, you just call it God because that's how we're defining God right here. Didn't Hegel say something like there is only one true contradiction in the genius? I probably butchered that. I don't know. I haven't heard of that claim. I haven't heard of that claim being made. Yeah, so I'm not sure if we have more. I just joined. I don't understand anything, but seems like a lot of fun. Yeah, we're just talking about process ontology, being God, and all those great things, right? Unfortunately, though, Mark, you're kind of at the tail end of this video. I'm about to actually stop streaming, so I'm sorry that you are getting into this pretty late. All right, guys. Looks like there's no more questions. I enjoy anybody who's come on. Thank you for coming on. Please subscribe to the channel if you can. If that is something that you do, or you have a Twitch account, I'd appreciate any sort of subscription so we can get this channel kind of going in the future. It's definitely hard to keep going without any sort of financial support in the background. I might be transferring over to YouTube as opposed to Twitch. I just think it's sort of better monetarily and just in terms of kind of cultivating an audience, I guess. It's just a little bit more professional than a gaming website. So for anyone who is watching here, I will be doing a few more Twitch episodes, and then eventually I'm going to be pushing you guys, the audience, to the YouTube channels of where the streams are automatically going to be uploaded. Yeah, pay Marty so he can become the new Hegel and Aristotle. That would be a dream bigger than yeah, I guess that's just a dream, you know. That would be insane. Those guys were super amazing, crazy good thinkers that I could never become, probably. But yes, please like and please subscribe. Please subscribe both to the YouTube and to the Twitch if you guys can. Follow me at both there, and subscribe here just so I can get a few more bucks. It's been a long year, and yeah. Create the greatest systematic philosophy ever, Clam. Okay, thank you. I appreciate the support. All right, guys. I'm gonna end the stream. Once again, thanks for coming. The worst I always am is with beginnings and ends. I'm not really good at concluding statements or giving good introductions to streams. But hopefully you guys enjoyed the main content, the main deal. And yes, I do have a Patreon, by the way, Bubba. You can check out the Patreon. Let me actually pull it up right here. It is right here on the bottom, by the way, / the philosophy chat for my Patreon. But if you guys ever wanted to donate any small amounts of money, feel free. Definitely help a poor future, by the way, PhD student. One thing I didn't tell the audience is that I just got accepted into a PhD program, and most likely will be continuing my PhD in philosophy now. So, see you guys later. You guys have a good one.